Thank you so much. I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Sune Lehmann, who is a professor of networks and complexity science at DTU Compute in the Technical University of Denmark. Many of you have heard about Sune's work on social networks. Thanks to the small world nature of such networks, I became familiar with Sune's research a long time ago when a mutual friend of ours shared with me one of the papers they'd written together. And it's been terrific fun to follow and learn from Sune's work over the years. Sune's research is devoted to the quantitative understanding of social systems based on massive data sets. He's a physicist by training with diplomas from the Niels Bohr Institute and PhD from the Technical University of Denmark, and this shows in his elegant theoretical papers. But importantly, his work has tangible applications to real-world problems, including human mobility, academic performance, epidemic spreading, and online behavior. He has published high-impact papers on these topics in Nature and PNAS, just to name a few. He also serves as a member of the Danish government's task force to model the spread of COVID-19. Sune is a terrific speaker, and so I'm really looking forward to this talk. So without any further ado, I'll hand the reins over to you. Thank you, Sune.
Thank you so much. This was unbelievably kind. Much too kind, of course, but I nevertheless appreciate it. So thank you so much. And yes, and let me just reiterate that it could feel lonely here giving these talks to a computer screen. So I welcome questions and interruptions as long as they're not mean, but friendly. And now I have to take over the screen. So let me try and see if I can figure that out. Share the screen. So I'm going to stop the other screen sharing. And here we are. This should now work. If it doesn't, somebody please stop me. So in a talk, it's important to cut straight to the chase, get right to your main result and capture everyone right away, and then you know that your attention is going to drift. But I'm going to try something dangerous because I'm a wild rebel and a renegade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with an enormous preamble to everything, and the reason I'm doing this is because the thing that I'll talk about actually has some deep connections. And so many years ago, back in 2010. When I was young and full of energy, I wrote a paper with YY An and James Bagro about finding communities in networks. And the core of that, the key point of that paper was that when we thought about communities in networks, we tend to think about pictures like this. There's a kind of intuitive definition that we have a community is a group of nodes. It could be friends in the social network, and they have a lot of internal connections, and then they're weakly connected to the rest of the network. And this famous picture is not the only one. If you look around in the literature, you find many pictures of the same kind of sense and or the same picture. And what we say in that paper, the point that we're making is that if it's true that a node is a member of many communities, so each node has many social contexts, let's say their family, their friends, or so on, then the network doesn't look so nicely clustered in groups that are neatly separable. So if every node is in the situation of the red node in this image, basically the whole network is just going to be one big hairball. And so we call this pervasive, the situation, we call it pervasive overlap. And we have this thing that it's true that the network is locally dense. There's many internal connections in each community, but actually, because each node is a member of many communities, the communities have more outgoing links than they have links that point inward, which is a kind of crazy thing. And just for the record, real world networks sometimes really look like that. They are, and this network has lots of structure. So there is something to it. And and just to kind of make this point, I guess, is that the idea, and we're not going to go into it, or we'll get back to it, I guess. The idea was to say that we can still find communities even in crazy networks like this, but the trick is that you should cluster the links in groups of links that are somehow structurally similar rather than nodes, and that the links typically have a single context and a single community that you can assign them to, while the nodes belong in many different places. So we wrote this paper, as you saw that I kind of humble bragged, showed the Nature page. We published this really well. And so a couple years later, I thought, this is my chance to get out. I'm going to do no more community detection. Instead, I'm going to get incredibly great data, because back in 2012, it was the dawn of the smartphone. And I thought, I'm going to build on the work done by pioneers like Sandy Penland at the Media Lab of using smartphones as data collection devices. And the thing that I'm going to add, instead of doing something brilliant, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to do something big. So I applied for money and I got 1,000 smartphones, and you can see the boxes here. We put custom software in every single one of those bad boys. It took a long time. So by the end of it, Arik, who was on top of the smartphone cases there, he was not smiling. None of us were. We actually made a mistake, so we had to do it twice. And the idea, the thing that was special, because people had used smartphones to collect data about social networks before, but the thing that was special here is that instead of just handing them out here and there to some people and having sparse connections between those people, we handed them out to all the freshmen at my university. So we had a much bigger cohort than people had done before. And we found a cohort that kind of constituted a single context. And then we collected data from these smartphones. And I'll talk a little bit more about what kind of data, but let's just look at it here. So here, I don't know how the animation runs over Zoom, but here you can see the GPS data. So we sample every 5 minutes. So we have to do these kind of smooth, weird movements. But every dot here is a student. You can see campus, and you can see the students coming in. Now lunch is coming, so they're going to go over to the canteen, a lot of them. That's happening right there. And you see them moving around. And I stress here, I always say this because it blows my own mind every time I say it, that this is not a simulation. This is not some kind of agent-based model. This is data. Each little blue dot is a human living person who has a dream of something they want to be someday. They have some parents who want them to do maybe something different. They have exams that they're worried about. It's the whole richness of the lived human experience in each of these data points. And the data that we collected was the mobility information, the GPS data, but we were especially interested in networks. So we collected the network of who's close to whom, the physical proximity network. Let me play it again. And we collected phone calls and text messages that people still used back then. We connected online social network friendships, so we know who was friends on Facebook and when they commented on each other's posts. And we also collected a lot of questionnaire data, so we know their personality and many, many other things. So it's a huge data set. And this is just one day that we're looking at, but we collected data for almost 2 years. So this was my attempt to get out of the community detection game. Now, in 2014, we had collected all this data, and we had kind of got the money saying, we're going to compare some networks and we're going to do some stuff. But to be totally honest, we didn't know what the hell now. Like, we had a great data set. Now let's go discover something. And one of the first things we did was we plotted the network of all the connections that occurred over a day. And lo and behold, it was very difficult to say anything about this network. So this is the physical proximity, people who are close to one another in physical space. Then we said, okay, but we have better time resolution. We sample Bluetooth proximity every 5 minutes. So what does it look like if we look at an hour? And interestingly, there's some structure there. And then we said, well, what does it look like if we just look at 5 minutes? So just the connections we've seen for 5 minutes. And something peculiar happened that even though we should have known, I didn't foresee this. So basically what you can see is that in the blue, the 5-minute time slices, the network just falls apart into little groups. If you think about it, it makes sense, because when you're meeting and you're close to someone else, you're not close to the whole world. It's not connected. There's each group here that's separated in the network display. Some people are sitting in a room somewhere. Some people are maybe out taking a walk together. Like many different situations, but basically they're physically close to one another. And then they're just spread out over campus and over, the city of Copenhagen. So it makes sense that it falls apart. And it also makes sense that it begins to become a coherent whole as time goes by, because I leave my one group that I'm with and I go over and see another group. And over a whole day, this big hairball evolves. But what we thought is, this is incredible, because we found a situation where more data makes things simpler, right? That basically we had solved community detection, which is, thousands of papers every year in network science. We solved it by just taking a very thin time slice, just looking at basically what happens for just 5 minutes. And this is counterintuitive, because normally if you want to model temporal dynamics in a network, everything becomes more cumbersome and more difficult. You have to use big, heavy mathematical frameworks and so forth. But here we had somehow, said that we're basically observing the network at the right temporal scale, and all of a sudden it becomes simple. And we could then take the groups in each slice and we can match them up over time slices. And the thing that comes out of it, we called it gatherings. And basically a gathering is just a meeting of some people over time. We tried to draw a picture of it. The picture is here on the left. Let's see if I can make this animation play. And so what you see now is over on the left. I hope you can see my mouse. Over on the left, you see each, we call it the sausage view. Each sausage here is a group. I guess the group over here maybe. And then the width of the sausage is the number of people in the group. And then you can see that the group starts at some point, it exists for some time, and then it dissolves. And since this is a university, you can kind of see at 8 a.m. some classes form and then they peter out. Some other classes meet at around 10. And a lot of the social activity that we see is actually given by classes. But the groups aren't synchronized. Like you can start a group anytime you like and so on. So this was already cool. When we talked to sociologists, they were going nuts about this stuff, because they were like, all of a sudden we can do statistics of meetings, and we can say, well, big groups, do they hang around each other longer? What are the statistics of big groups? What are the statistics of small groups? How does it look when it is? So already this was a kind of a quantitative advance, which was cool. And here we can do a little aside and saying that connecting to, what's going on in network science now, which I hope to get to since I have 40 minutes, we can think of these as higher order structures in the network. And we think that this higher order structure, and we argue that in the paper we wrote about this, is a great way to model these networks. That these gatherings basically are little cliques that persist for some time, and then, as we'll see, they reform again and so on. But of course, as the sociologists pointed out, they have their own internal structure, and for some purposes, maybe we want to explore that. So I'm not saying now we should model everything as these high order structures. it could be that we're very curious about the people who leave the group at some point, or the dynamics about how it forms or whatever. But it's an interesting level of description. And I'll come back to, I'm highlighting this now because I want to come back to it in a little bit. But anyway, going back to the gatherings, if the group of people in the gathering are truly friends, then they're going to meet again. Because what characterizes friends is that they meet more than once. At least that's a one. I don't even know how to characterize friends, but presumably you would assume that if you call someone your friend, you would meet them once. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition, I suspect. And so sure enough, if we look at these gatherings, we find that there tend to be the same people in the gathering over time, and that they have a tendency to meet again. So not only do they have an extension in time on the day they meet, but they meet again and again over days and weeks and months. And that's something you can see here. So here we selected an individual marked in red. We took their social groups, which are these gatherings that tend to meet, and we look at how they recur over time. And so you can kind of see that for the individual, there's a pink group that meets, then something's going on here. There's a vacation where they're kind of very intensely connected to these two groups. And then the semester starts, and then they over time engage with these groups. Each row is a group, and then in the columns, it's noted when the group is active with the color. And this is a great way to represent, we argue also in the paper, the activity of a node, because there's a kind of, like you can basically think of the node as jumping instead of the whole complexity of the network and all its many thousands of links and hundreds and thousands and millions of events coming at you. You just think of your path through the network as jumping from one group to another group to another group. And as we realized, there's a beautiful analogy with how you move through space. So just like you move from one space or one geographical location to another geographical location to another geographical location, basically the plot in C is analogous to the one that I just showed you back here, only that they stacked all the activations on top of one another. And so in this paper, we showed that there's a cool framework for modeling networks. And we also point out this deep analogy. And because we also know the movement of the students, we can look at predictability in terms of social space and in terms of geographical space and the correlations between them. And we write about that in this paper, which was, as I point out here, fantastic to finally publish, because it means that this crazy data collection, we actually got something out of it that the funders would also appreciate. So that was a big relief. So now, so remember, we started data collection in 2012. It was a long and stressful time, but it was nice to finally get something out of there. And then the year after, and I promise you that this is true, I finally figured out that we were doing the exact same thing as I was doing in 2010. This is a figure that Bagro made, and I still am impressed with the perspective he managed to get in here, turning everything and so on. But this is how we were thinking about this, the overlapping community structure, all the way back in 2010. And so the point here to the young scholars out there on the internets is that, like, it's impossible to think of something new. I literally went out and bought 1,000 smartphones trying to do something different, and I ended up doing exactly the same thing as I had done when I was a postdoc. So it's very difficult to be a new and creative. We found a different way there and still learned a lot. So it's not a tragedy or anything, but I think it was really kind of mind-blowing for me to realize that it is literally the same idea from a couple of years ago. So anyway, I thought about this. We did a lot of many other things. But I kind of thought, this is true. I thought we figured out community detection in a way. We figured out that if you just had the right temporal data, community detection becomes easy. And so in 2018, I had a master student who needed a project, and I said, well, we have all these many networks. Let's try it out on the Facebook network. So I said, let's get the Facebook data of all these people, the dynamic data, and let's try and look at the thin time slices, and let's do all this one more time and see what it looks like on the Facebook. So we plotted them, and lo and behold, it didn't look at all like we wanted it to look. I looked at it in 5 minutes. It's something completely different. So the activity on Facebook is the likes and the comments on comments and so on. And if we aggregate it for longer timescales, it also looked different. And if we look at timescales of the entire day, once again, like we don't get the hairball, we get something that's totally different and strange. And so that was disconcerting and making me unhappy, which is a good sign because it means that something interesting is happening, right? And we thought, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to use information, like we made very complicated. Actually, this is a super smart student. I could never have done this alone. But with him, we made some cool algorithms where basically we looked at the community structure in each layer, and then in a very clever way, we incorporate information from neighboring layers. And what happens is that the parameter that you see is how much information we're pulling in from the neighboring layers. And if the information we pull in is very low, we get beautiful communities, as you see over on the left. Then the communities actually make sense. But as we pull in more information from neighboring layers, the communities get more and more crazy. And basically what happens is that each node just forms a long, deep community with itself and doesn't really connect to any neighbors in the graph. We're like, what is happening? And we later developed this even more and wrote a paper about it. And it is useful for many other contexts, this algorithm. So here's a little paper plug. And so here you can kind of see how these communities that work well in single layers just become these long things, right? And you compare and contrast this with the beautiful sausage view structure from the Bluetooth network. So somehow the algorithm does not work for Facebook. And the question now is, what is happening? What's going on? What is it that we can learn here? And just to make sure that I'm not the only one here, does anyone want to chime in? It's okay. Can I get someone? Is it too crazy to ask? Seems like it is. Maybe I am all alone. There we go.
Just letting
Andy,
you know you're
here.
not the only one here. So
Good.
We
Because
hear
I
you
would take
loud
it
and
down a
clear.
notch if it was
Sune.
just me.
and I'll just make a note to encourage that if people have questions, please go to the Q&A or raise your hand and we'll unmute you once we get to the end of the talk.
But does anyone want to chime in? Can we activate the audience? I've taken courses on being a good teacher, but I think it generalizes that it's good for the audience to wake up a little bit and be part of things. Something in the Q&A maybe?
You're getting a lot of great support in the Q&A. No questions yet.
All right. I'll tell the answer. I'll let it go. So what's going on? The thing that's going on is that the networks are completely different at the microscopic scale. All right. So let's illustrate that with a network that we can very easily think about, namely the phone network of people making phone calls to one another. If we have a very thin slice of the network of phone calls, we realize that there's no network at all. It's just pairs of people speaking on the phone. So the structure that you get in all those papers that you read about the phone network, that's when you aggregate over time. But in a very thin time slice, the network disappears. It's just pairs of people on the phone, and the face-to-face network that we discussed at length in the beginning of the talk is kind of natively cliques, groups of people that are hanging out together. And similarly for Facebook. I'll get into what Facebook looks like in a little bit. But the point that I'm making, and which goes back to now the point of the talk and the title of the talk, is that the process that generates the data imposes important constraints. So in the real world meetings of face-to-face, the thing that imposes constraint is physical space. You can't be two places at once. You can't meet physically with someone who is 200 miles away. Yes, I saw you, Rosemary.
Yes, I just wanted to interrupt with a question from Christian, who actually expressed a question that I also had, which is, what do you mean when you say including information from other layers?
So I take the network and I chop it up into time slices. And the other layers, it's a good question, I should have been more explicit, is simply the neighboring time slices. But it is confusing, and I see that it's confusing because, of course, there's also layers of people meeting in the real world and layers of text messages and so on. But I mean layers like time slices. For now, I keep each channel separate and just think of the time slices as layers. And of course, they're not even layers. It's a representation that I chose because it's simpler to think about and work with. But super good question. Thanks for clarifying.
Thanks.
Okay, so in the phone network, the process that generates the data has to do with what some engineers came up with when they wanted to start conversations between people that were far away from one another. So it's a completely different, it's an engineering. And having made this realization, I thought is something more general going on. I came up with a great taxonomy. Unfortunately, I realized someone else had thought about it. And so like a nice split, although not necessarily the only split that one could make, we can also discuss that, is to divide. And so let's limit this to communication networks. Although I think it is quite general, we can think about communication as something that can happen from one to one, one to many, and many to many. All right, and the other dimension that's interesting for this is synchronous and asynchronous. So synchronous is when something is going on, it's live, and you both have to be there for it to be happening. Asynchronous is when you set something in motion, and then at some later point, someone can react to it. So you can send a letter in the mail, it's going to arrive, and someone else can open it at some point. You can send an email, there's someone else that's going to check it on their own time later on. That's the asynchronous. And so you can have one-to-one synchronous, which would be like phone calls. You can have many-to-many asynchronous, which would be a kind of, like social networking sites where each node can, at least in principle, contribute and see these conversations that they're part of. And what's also interesting, of course, is that each of these types of this matrix here of synchronous, asynchronous, and one-to-one, many-to-one, and many-to-many has an associated network footprint. So the phone network is one-to-one synchronous, and the face-to-face network that we talked a lot about in the beginning of the talk is many-to-many synchronous. And I think that the simplification, if we're generalizing, is that we should think of networks as composed of these sequences of things that happen in this class, in this sequence. Okay, so I say sequences of fundamental structures. I promise I'll explain what I mean by that. But the intuition is, for example, in the face-to-face network, we should model it as sequences of these gatherings, and these gatherings should repeat in patterns that look more or less like the patterns that you observe empirically. And so just to be more clear about the terminology, I think that that each element of this matrix, I call that a dynamic class, which is like the type of micro, what should we call it? Like the time of microstructure that appears when you look at very thin time slices of the network. And then the fundamental structure is that the structure that, you know, is characteristic of each dynamic class. So those are like the type of things you would typically observe in a network of that class. And here I should say that I mean the whole thing of it, including its temporal span. So in the many-to-many, the fundamental structure would be the gather. And that's exactly kind of a higher order structure of the network. That's the type that we would typically observe in a network of this dynamic class, right? Sorry for saying many words in an incomprehensible way again and again, but the point I hope is still clear, which is that instead of thinking of the network as composed of nodes and links coming at you, it's often useful for when we want to understand what's happening to think of them as composed of these fundamental structures, which are in the communication networks, they always correspond to communication events. And I think that's how we should break networks down when we model temporal networks. And I think that's the perspective through the lens through which that they're simple, they become simple. And so if we take the asynchronous many-to-many case, we could take Reddit posts, for example. And if we want to think about the network of Reddit, we should think of the network as composed of posts and how they connect to one another. And of course, it can also be instructive to understand the internal structure of posts. Like if we want to model it, we also have to know what posts look like. And actually it did. So if you see, like I've done no work in this talk, it's just all conceptual, but with a student, I looked a little bit. So I'm going to give you just some fun results just by a grad student who did a little project with me. And this is the point about like how the internal structure can be interesting. Because of course, if we want to model the many-to-many asynchronous network as Reddit posts, like we need to understand what are they. The gatherings are easy to understand, but what's going on with the posts? And so basically we can take a post on Reddit and we can represent it as a network. I didn't write the figure text, so there's some very poetic language in it. But basically this just shows how do you convert the post to a comment tree. You can also build an author network of what's going on in here in each post, how the authors connect to one another. And so we were doing this, trying to kind of do this mapping out of these Reddit posts just to see what they look like. And what we found is kind of fun and interesting in its own right. So this is an aside, but I thought it was cool. So basically what we find out is that even if we match on cascade size or activity size of these posts, what I find is that puppies and politics have different discussions. We can tell them apart. So basically, puppies' comments have different tree structures than political discussions, and they have different author structures than political discussions. And if we do the distributions of all these things you can calculate about them, there are very different distributions, and you can tell them apart with 90% accuracy without looking at the content, which kind of blew my mind. So it's fun to look at the internal structure also, but if you want to look at the whole network, then you take these parts and then you put those together, you see how individuals participate in things that are going on. That's how I think we should model the networks and their dynamics. Coming back to the main thread, I also think to be clear that these dynamic classes matter a lot when we model networks and when we compare them. And so we discussed community detection at some length, but also with null models for temporal networks, it's important. So here are some pictures of the many null models that you can do for temporal networks. Why are these pictures so complicated? I have to take one more step back to explain that for the people that don't do this every day. So here we go. It's going to be 45 minutes, by the way, and not 40 minutes. I spent a long time on the beginning. So 45 minutes. I'm sorry, I promise only 5 more. So why is it? Well, it turns out that when we're modeling temporal networks, it's difficult. We don't really know what to do a lot of the time. So the workflow of a temporal networks paper looks something like this. You find an evolving network. Then you simulate some dynamic process on it. Could be an epidemic, it could be something else. And then you say, now I want to learn about what the structure does to this model. And you randomize things that you care about. So you could shuffle the edges so that the connections become randomized. You could shuffle the edges within each time slice, but have the same number of edges conserved within each time slice. You could shuffle the timings of the edges so that they become more homogeneous over time. You can shuffle timestamps and so on and so on. And so the 2 crazy pictures that we saw here basically is giving an overview of the many different variations of shufflings and making uniform or non-uniform that you can do. All right. And we rarely measure any structure of these networks. But the problem here, and this I think is really important, is that many of these null models result in microscopic configurations that could never happen. Right? Because we know that what happens at the micro level in these dynamic networks is very, very organized. And it's organized by these constraints that are put in by the way that the data itself is generated. So like when you shuffle the timing of an edge, for example, it's going to show up in a place, right? You're going to remove all the cliques in the network where everything should be cliques. Or you're going to create triangles in a network where there should never be local triangles or whatever. But the dynamic classes give you constructive ideas for null models. It's also, if you have a big computer and you're crazy good at counting, like the authors of this paper, where there's a group of computer scientists that said, we're going to look at some enormous huge networks, and then we're going to count motifs. Then when you then do the counting and you want to interpret your findings, it's again clear that the typical motifs you observe on a network will be completely determined by the microstructure of the thing that generates the dynamics. So you're going to see, and I haven't checked this, so I might be totally wrong, but it just occurs to me that some of the counts here look suspiciously similar, and it's interesting to think if that has anything to do with the microstructure of the networks that are being analyzed. It also comes in when you look at spreading on networks. Again, I'm listing some papers. I haven't looked at the data sets, but that's why I called it an intriguing possibility. It also is like Sune is too lazy to do the work. But in the literature of epidemic spreading, we do see that some papers say that actually the temporal network makes things slower. So when it's a temporal network, things slow down. And we also see in other networks that things go faster. But when we think about it, it's clear that some dynamical processes are going to be very fast on some types of network, like the ones that have many cliques and so on, and they're going to be slow on networks that only have isolated edges and that take a long time to integrate it over before you actually get a network. So this thing that is spreading on temporal networks faster or slower, well, I think it depends on the dynamic class of the network. Complex contagion is a special case where this is very important, of course. I wrote a paper about this. I didn't have any funding, so I couldn't get any students to work on it. So I just wrote the kind of the ideas. Basically, it was like a grant application that never got funded. So now I'm just telling everyone about it because I wanted other people to work on this. But so it's kind of speculative, all of this, but I still hope that maybe it can inspire someone to start looking at it. And like you can see with the rhetoric example, I'm kind of a little bit working on it. And so philosophical point here is what to measure, right? Peter Holme, a fantastic scientist and researcher, he's written some reviews on this. And here he says something that, I mean, this is just me hoping, but I still think it's cool. He said, you know, when we look at static networks, it was all about measuring stuff. You measure degree distribution, you measure all kinds of things. But in temporal networks, there's been nothing to measure. Similar ubiquitous structures are yet to be discovered. Maybe they don't even exist. And then he says, this has led the research down a slightly different path where the focus is dynamic systems on networks and how they're affected by structure. This is the thing I said about the workflow of temporal networks paper, right? But what if these fundamental structures could be a thing to measure that could help us categorize and understand networks? And then also, why, like, this is in a sense trivial. So why hasn't the point been made yet? And I really think that it has to do with the fact that as you aggregate, the networks become similar. So I think like one of the reasons I am making this point is because I was crazy enough, and there's a lot of work, and I don't recommend it to anyone, to get all this data with many different networks for the same population. And I could think that I had solved the problem, try it on Facebook, and realize that it failed. And that's how we got here. And I'm done. It was 46 minutes, but I almost made it. So thank you so much for your attention, I think is enough. And I'm here to answer questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Those of you in the audience, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I see that there are a couple questions already, but I'm going to be greedy and ask my question first, which is, so in practice, do you think that the null models need to be generated by simulation from the generative models, or do you think that there are general statistical features that arise from the networks being asynchronous or synchronous or one-to-many, et cetera, that one could condition on when shuffling in that sort of permutation procedure?
Well, I mean, I think that whatever is happening in a very narrow time window shapes the dynamics, if the dynamics are something where that's on that time scale, right? You can't have processes that do their own integration over the network, blah, 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 and then it's not so important. But for a lot of things like complex contagion and so on, it's like this simultaneous activation is important. And so whatever null models you build, I think they have to be, if you want to study dynamics on the network, they have to be true to whatever is going on in that time slice. And so then the question becomes, how do you make them? Right? This is what you're asking in a way. And I think the trivial way to make them is figure out what the fundamental structures are in your system, if you can, and understand each structure, and then start thinking about building networks that originate from something that looks like those structures, or take the structures and shuffle them around at a time or whatever, but something where your micro structure of the network is true to what you would observe. And it's also, if you want to compare to other networks, you have to make sure that you don't have a completely different microstructure in that network that would trivially make everything that you would measure on that network different.
Mm-hmm. I see Christian has his hand raised, and since he's been admitted, maybe we can unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm unmuted now, so I wasn't sure if you could hear me.
I can hear
hi, Sune. It's Christian Webpage.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Yes,
so
likewise.
just a quick question is, even in the standard definition of modularity, one is subtracting the random, the random network possibilities, right? So has anybody done the equivalent definitions of modularity by subtracting the random network subject to, for example, random walks in a two-dimensional space or something like that? It seems to me that the basic definitions based on your perspective should be changed to normalize them, quote unquote, as a function of the possibilities of the network. So is this something that people are doing? Suddenly it opened a whole set of questions about this basic definition that should exist already with the constraints that you're talking about.
No, I don't think anyone is doing anything like that. But I agree. Of course, all of this, as you aggregate, the networks from different dynamic classes become more and more similar if they represent similar underlying systems, right? So human beings have some kind of social structure that we can't observe, and then our phone calls is one representation of that, and our Facebook friendships is another. And as we aggregate over time, they're going to be pretty similar. But so this becomes mostly important if you're interested in dynamics, or if you're simulating dynamics on one of the classes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you for asking the question. Yes, I'm just I'm waiting for if there is something.
There's a comment from Luis, along with applause for you. He says, Laszlo famously said, think networks. We know because he put it in his book. However, there are some, maybe many situations in which the network formalization may actually make the problem more complex than it could be if one used other approaches. I'm curious.
Yes. No, but I agree strongly, right? Like the whole point of the work that I presented around the groupings in the face-to-face networks is that we don't need the network. Like the fundamental thing that's happening there is that groups of people meet. And of course, it might be that we want to zoom in on some meeting. And if we zoom in hard enough and we look at that meeting, we know that it's not everyone speaking to each other all at the same time. Maybe one person is dominating. Maybe there's a stronger tie between one, and maybe we need the network. But what we show in that paper is that in a weird sense, we can think of the groups as the thing that's generating the network. And we simplify things. Instead of hundreds of thousands of edges, we have a finite alphabet of groups, and we can use information theory in new ways to understand and quantify predictability and outcomes in the network. And so this is the point. And I think, and I think it's like that often, that there are these communication events, and I think they can dramatically simplify a lot of what we want to do with networks.
Yeah.
So fantastic question. I applaud, I clap, and applaud it right back. Yes.
Hi, am I audible right now?
Yes.
Yes.
I have a question about the resolution with which you used to find these structures. So suppose if we look into a small enough interval versus something larger, like as in your case, the social network in a day had more structure than within 5 minutes. Now, suppose if we take some interval, and what if we don't find a clique there? What if we find two triangles, or like one simplexes, and like they're one or two edges away from being a more complicated structure that's finite? So like, where do we set the resolution so that we can decide on the finite set of structures we're going to deal with?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So I don't think there's a general answer to this, because answers would be very different in asynchronous networks, for example. But if we go to this like synchronous many-to-many network that is the face-to-face network, the answer is that I think that we can say that overall, a simplifying assumption that's pretty accurate is that if a group of people is in a meeting, we can just say that all those links are active. So the network basically, in my mind, can just be modeled as cliques. So cliques that occur. And then over time, members can drop in and out of those cliques, right? So you can you'll have a clique. That's the meeting right now, and then someone can leave and go to another meeting or whatever, but the clique is there. So that kind of solves that. And of course, if you have a dyad, it's just a clique of size 2. Now, what about the time resolution? Should we observe it on 5 seconds? Should it be 5 minutes? Should it be 10 minutes? And basically, what we want, if we don't want things to get too complicated, is we want to observe it as a resolution that is shorter than the time it takes for someone to be in one meeting and show up at another meeting. Because as we start to have the same person in 2 different meetings in the same time slice, then we begin to get in trouble, right? So we can then look at what's the typical duration of the meeting, what's the typical, and so on. And it turns out around 15 minutes you can get away with and still observe fine community resolution. But as you start to extend beyond 15 minutes, you begin to have the situation that the same person is present in multiple cliques, and then they're connected in the network. And that's the problem. Of course, you can never get out of it, but that's like a little bit of noise in practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks. And I have a follow-up question if I'm allowed that. What now you had mentioned, what you're saying sounds like the resolution is set based on the context we are in. Is there some, it's just a question, I want to know if you have thought about it. Like, is there something more, a universal sort of structure that happens in different contexts that you think might be a viable, reliable candidate?
There might be, but I don't have it. The way that I have to work is, and I think for a while probably we have to do this, we have to think about the network, and we have to think about what kind of constraints are put on this network by physical space or the engineering, that like the engineers who built it. What is it that kind of, but I think that the thing that I'm pointing out is that in these communication networks, it's the communication event that's the organizing principle, right? So if you want to take Twitter, I send out a tweet, and then that's a node in the network. And when I send it out, nothing is there. And then, but it's active, and it can now be observed by some people. And then downstream, a lot of things can happen to that tweet. But basically, the cascade of activity following that tweet is a, you can define that as some kind of communication event. I think that is the unit of observation that's interesting on Twitter. And then I would think of Twitter as a kind of overlapping communication events, or the authors interacting with different types of communication events with other authors or so on. That's kind of the idea.
Right. Thanks. Thank you very much. It clarifies things a lot.
Cool.
It's a question from Neil McLaren in the chat, asking whether communities in the time aggregated cell phone networks match up between the different layers in the sense of modalities. So Facebook, SMS, etc. Are the microstructures different, but the macro conclusions the same?
Yes.
Short answer.
I mean, of course there are differences. People you tend to be friends with on Facebook are different than the people you call on the phone. Phone call is a more personal thing, and there are some people that I'm friends with on Facebook that would be weird if I called them up. They'd be like, what is happening here? So of course, some things are different, and the different network manifest different kinds of relationships. But the macro conclusions are more or less the same. And that's why this, I think, that hasn't been kind of explored more, because we're so used to the macro network and that it represents something that we simply forgot that, like, especially when we think dynamics, all this stuff is going on in the individual time slices that we know about. There are all these constraints about what can happen. There are many links that just could never exist for whatever reason. And we're ignoring it. And I think it's crazy.
any other questions from our audience?
I think we are close to our time now. Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you, Sune, for presenting a very engaging conversation. And we had a great questions and great participation. I think we had almost 60 participants at our peak. So thank you very much. And I see that there is a last slide there that might have been put up. Did you want to mention that at all?
I just want to say that I have a hobby, which is me chatting with scientists and podcasting it. And there are some of Northwestern's very own on the list of interviewees, or at least also Northwestern alums, I think. So maybe that's interesting to some people. And I'm going to be making more podcasts, but if you're interested, you could check it out on all the podcast places. Yeah, so it's like Sune's little hobby project, but I like talking to people. So yeah, that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you again. And I would just like to mention, as we are a little over the hour, please join us next week. We have postdocs talking with us from A to P, from anthropology to physics, and a few in between. So please join us. We will send out notifications very soon about who will be on deck for next week. And thanks so much, Rosemary, as always, for being such a great leader within NICO and helping us by moderating this really interesting conversation with Sune. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our participants, Andy, Emily, thanks so much.
Thank you. And thank you also, Rosemary, so much. It was really
Thank you for a great talk, Sune.
Really cool. See you all soon. And